Everyone thinks they know how World War II ended. Hitler shoots himself in his bunker on April 30th, 1945. Berlin falls to the Red Army. Victory in Europe is declared on May 8th. The flags come out, the champagne flows, and the boys come home. But that is not where the story ends. That is where the reckoning begins. Between 1945 and 1950, over 400,000 Germans sat in Allied internment camps awaiting judgment. The guards who held the keys to Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Mauthausen, Stutthof. The men and women who pulled triggers, turned gas valves, and signed death certificates. What happened to them when the tables turned? How many faced the gallows? How many walked free? The numbers tell a story no one wants to hear. In the gray light of April 29th, 1945, soldiers of the American 42nd Infantry Division rolled toward the Bavarian town of Dachau. What they found, 12 years after the first concentration camp opened, would trigger immediate vengeance killings. Sergeant Felix Sparks commanded the task force that breached the camp perimeter. Railway cars packed with 3,900 corpses lined the tracks, bodies stacked like cordwood, flesh melted down to bone. The smell hit the Americans before they saw the carnage. When they entered the compound, emaciated prisoners rushed forward, lifting GIs onto their shoulders despite barely having strength to stand. Then came the payback. American troops killed between 30 and 50 German guards that afternoon, according to official investigations. SS personnel who had surrendered were lined against walls and shot. 16 died in the coal yard, 17 more at Tower B. A camp inmate joined the killing, beating one SS man to death with a shovel while American soldiers watched. Lieutenant William Walsh shot 4 German soldiers in a boxcar who had already given up. Private Albert Pruitt climbed in after and finished off the wounded with execution shots to the head. The official army investigation called it a clear violation of international law. Nothing happened to the killers. If you value documented wartime justice history like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you are hearing this from. The script is researched and factual, using sources from the National Archives investigation of alleged mistreatment of German guards at Dachau, released in 1992, and detailed interrogation records from U.S. Army photographer documentation made public in 1997. Now back to the information. The pattern repeated across liberated Europe. When British forces entered Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945, they found 55,000 prisoners among piles of unburied corpses. Typhus had killed thousands. Starvation had claimed thousands more. The remaining SS guards who stayed behind were immediately arrested and housed in nearby Wehrmacht facilities. Unlike Dachau, the British followed procedure. They wanted trials. They wanted the world to see what Nazi Germany had done. The Belsen trial opened in Nuremberg on September 17, 1945. 45 defendants sat in the dock, including Camp Commandant Joseph Kramer, known as the Beast of Belsen, 16 male SS officers, 16 female guards, 12 prisoner functionaries called capos who had collaborated with their captors. The charges covered crimes at both Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz, since many guards had transferred between camps. War correspondents from around the globe packed the courtroom. For the first time, the public heard detailed testimony about gas chambers and systematic murder in the extermination camps. Irma Grese, 22 years old, had been an Oberaufseherin at Auschwitz before coming to Belsen. Witnesses described how she selected prisoners for death with a casual pointing of her finger, how she beat inmates with a braided whip, how she set dogs on prisoners during roll call. During the trial, she showed no emotion when listening to testimony. When the death sentence was read on November 17, 1945, she initially appeared indifferent. Then she broke down sobbing in her cell. The verdicts came after 54 days of testimony. 11 defendants received death sentences. 18 got prison terms ranging from 1 to 15 years. 14 were acquitted. Joseph Kramer was condemned to hang. So was Elizabeth Volkenrath, the head female guard. Fritz Klein, the camp doctor who had overseen medical experiments, also faced execution. The sentences were carried out at Hamelin Prison on December 1945, by British executioner Albert Pierrepoint. Grace was the second woman hanged that morning. Her final word was "Schnell, quick," but Belsen was just the beginning. American military tribunals at Dachau processed hundreds of concentration camp cases between 1945 and 1947. The major Dachau camp trial began in November 1945 with 42 defendants. Commandant Martin Gottfried Weiss sat in the dock alongside his deputy commanders, guards, and medical staff. All 42 were found guilty. 36 received death sentences on December 13, 1945. 28 were hanged on May 28th and 29th, 1946, including Weiss and camp doctor Klaus Schilling, who had conducted malaria experiments on prisoners. The Mauthausen trials followed the same pattern. The complex near Linz, Austria, had been one of the most brutal camps in the Nazi system. Prisoners called it the bone grinder. They were forced to carry 50-kilogram stone blocks up 186 steps from the quarry. Those who collapsed created domino effects, prisoners tumbling down the stairs onto each other. The SS guards nicknamed Jewish victims they threw from the cliff Fallschirmspringer, parachutists. When American forces of the 11th Armored Division liberated Mauthausen on May 5, Mars 1945, most guards had fled. Around 30 SS personnel who remained were killed by prisoners. Some had their heads impaled on stakes. Others were beheaded with their own knives. Camp Commandant Franz Zierreis was captured 3 weeks later in a mountain hut. He was shot in the abdomen during what authorities called an escape attempt, and died after giving a deathbed confession that became evidence at Nuremberg. The first Mauthausen trial convened at Dachau from March 29th to May 13th, 1946. 61 defendants faced charges including Deputy Camp Commandant Hans Altfoldisch, Guard Battalion Commander Victor Zoller, and Doctors Friedrich Entress and Eduard Krebsbach. All were found guilty. 58 received death sentences. 3 got life imprisonment. On appeal, 9 death sentences were commuted. American authorities executed 49 defendants at Landsberg Prison on May 27th and 28th, 1947. The sole exception was Otto Striegel, whose execution was delayed until June 20th, 1947. Dr. Krebsbach had administered lethal injections of benzene directly into prisoners' hearts. Dr. Entress had conducted medical experiments that killed hundreds. Gauleiter August Eigruber, who oversaw the camp's establishment, was hanged on May 28th, 1947. A second Mauthausen trial in August 1947 sentenced 4 more defendants to death. They were executed at Landsberg on November 19th, 1948. The Polish authorities conducted their own reckoning at Stutthof concentration camp near Danzig. Between 1946 and 1953, 6 separate trials processed 72 camp personnel. The first trial opened in Gdansk on April 25th, 1946, with 13 defendants including Guard Commander Johann Pauls and female overseers Jenny Wanda Barkman and Elizabeth Becker. 12 were sentenced to death. They were executed by short drop hanging at Biskupia Gorka on July 4th, 1946. The pattern continued through 1948. The second Stutthof trial sentenced 10 more defendants to death in October 1947. 9 SS men and 1 capo were executed on October 28th, 1948. The executions included Kurt Dietrich, Karl Eggert, Theodor Meyer, Ewald Foth, Albert Paulitz, Fritz Peters, Hans Rack, Paul Wellnitz, and Karl Zurel. A fourth trial in November 1947 condemned Willy Butt, who was hanged on January 10th, 1949. Meanwhile, British authorities prosecuted Stutthof Commandant Max Pauli, who had also run Neuengamme concentration camp. His trial lasted from March 18th to May 13th, 1946, in Hamburg. Pauli and 11 co-defendants were found guilty. All 12 received death sentences. They were executed by Albert Pierrepoint at Hamlin Prison on October 8, 1946. The scope of Allied justice extended far beyond major camps. American military tribunals at Dachau conducted 465 separate trials involving 1,676 defendants. These included personnel from satellite camps, subcamps, and detention facilities throughout the Nazi system, guards from camps like Nordhausen. Flossenburg, Mühldorf, and dozens of smaller installations faced judgment. But the numbers reveal a troubling reality. Of approximately 2,000 SS personnel who worked at Stutthof alone, only 72 faced trial. At Bergen-Belsen, at least 480 people had served as guards or staff. Only 45 were prosecuted. The majority simply disappeared into post-war Germany and Austria. Many adopted new identities. Others fled to South America. Some continued living under their real names, protected by the chaos of displaced persons and destroyed records. The Cold War complicated everything. By 1948, American priorities shifted from denazification to containing Soviet expansion. The Marshall Plan required German cooperation, skilled technicians, scientists, and administrators were needed for reconstruction, regardless of their wartime activities. Operation Paperclip secretly brought Nazi scientists to America. The Gehlen organization employed former SS intelligence officers against the Soviets. Even those convicted often served reduced sentences. The Landsberg prison housed hundreds of war criminals condemned by American tribunals. By 1951, most had been released through commutation programs. General Lucius Clay, the American military governor, personally reviewed every death sentence. He commuted many to life imprisonment. Others were reduced to 15 or 20-year terms. Political pressure from German churches, refugee organizations, and right-wing politicians demanded clemency for the little fish, who had merely followed orders. The women guards faced particular scrutiny during trials, but often received unexpected mercy afterward. Female defendants at Belsen had their sentences drastically reduced on appeal. By June 1955, every survivor of the Belsen trial had been released from prison. Even those originally sentenced to life imprisonment were freed within a decade. The rationale was always the same. They were following orders. They feared for their own lives. They had no choice. This clemency extended to some of the most vicious perpetrators. SS Dr. Hans Eisele from Dachau was sentenced to death in 1945, but had his sentence commuted and was released in 1952. When new charges were brought in 1958, he fled to Egypt, where he practiced medicine under a false identity. Friedrich Hartenstein, commandant of Auschwitz-Birkenau, was sentenced to death by a French military tribunal but died in prison before execution. His subordinates received terms of 10 to 20 years, and most were released by the mid-1950s. The Soviets took a harder line in their occupation zone. They established special camps in former concentration camp sites like Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald. These held both Nazi war criminals and political prisoners deemed hostile to communist rule. Conditions were brutal. Of approximately 150,000 Germans detained in Soviet special camps between 1945 and 1950, over 42,000 died from starvation, disease, and execution. But even Soviet justice was inconsistent. Those who collaborated with occupation authorities could protect Nazi members from prosecution. Having connections with the occupiers shielded many from denazification laws. The French conducted limited trials in their zone. They sentenced Natzweiler concentration camp personnel, including Commandant Friedrich Hartenstein. But French priorities focused on German industrialists who had used forced labor rather than camp guards. The emphasis was on extracting reparations and rebuilding the French economy. Most minor camp personnel in the French zone escaped prosecution entirely. German courts proved even more lenient when they took over proceedings. Between 1947 and 1949, German denazification tribunals reviewed thousands of cases. The classification system divided defendants into major offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and persons exonerated. The vast majority were classified as followers or exonerated entirely. Typical sentences were fines, temporary employment restrictions, or brief imprisonment. Time spent in Allied detention camps counted as service of sentence. Only one German trial was ever held for crimes at Bergen-Belsen. At Jena in 1949, the defendant was acquitted. Over 200 other SS personnel known by name never faced charges. No Wehrmacht soldiers were prosecuted for crimes against Soviet prisoners of war at Bergen-Belsen, despite the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg finding such treatment constituted war crimes. The excuses remained constant throughout all proceedings. I was following orders. I feared for my life if I refused. I was just doing my job. I never personally killed anyone. The defense of superior orders had been explicitly rejected at Nuremberg, but lower-level courts often accepted it as mitigation. The concept of collective guilt gave way to individual responsibility, which in turn gave way to collective amnesia. Documents reveal the calculation behind this lenient approach. American officials worried that harsh punishment would drive Germans toward communism. British authorities feared that continued prosecutions would undermine efforts to establish democratic institutions in West Germany. The emerging Cold War logic required former enemies to become allies against the Soviet Union. Denazification became denazification. The Nuremberg trials established the principle that superior orders provided no defense for crimes against humanity. But this applied mainly to major war criminals. For the thousands of guards, clerks, drivers, and capos who enabled the Holocaust machinery, justice proved far more elusive. The perpetrators had names, addresses, and often continued living openly in their home communities. Local residents knew who had worked at nearby camps, yet silence prevailed. Church leaders played a crucial role in this clemency movement. Protestant and Catholic authorities argued that Christian forgiveness required mercy for those who had served the regime. Bishop Theophil Wurm of Württemberg personally lobbied Allied commanders for sentence reductions. Cardinal Clemens von Galen opposed the execution of war criminals on moral grounds. These religious interventions carried significant weight with occupation authorities, many of whom shared Christian values. Political calculations also influenced clemency decisions. The Christian Democratic Union, led by Konrad Adenauer, represented millions of Germans who had been at least nominally complicit in Nazi rule. These voters needed to be integrated into the new democratic system. Harsh justice might alienate them permanently. Better to draw a line under the past and move forward with reconstruction and European integration. The result was a system where mass murder became a bureaucratic offense punishable by a few years in prison. Guards who had beaten prisoners to death received the same sentences as black market dealers or currency speculators. the scale of the crimes became irrelevant compared to the political necessity of reintegration. Some trials continued into the 1960s and 70s. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trial from 1963 to 1965 prosecuted 22 defendants, but most received sentences of 3 to 14 years. By this time, witnesses had died or could no longer identify perpetrators. Evidence had been destroyed or lost. The burden of proof had shifted entirely to prosecutors, who struggled to build cases decades after the fact. Even these later proceedings revealed the limitations of post-war justice. The Demjanjuk case illustrated how difficult it became to establish individual guilt. Initially deported to Israel as Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka, he was later found to have served at Sobibor and Majdanek instead. His conviction was overturned multiple times as evidence proved unreliable. He died before final resolution of his case. Recent prosecutions focus on accessory charges rather than direct murder. Oskar Groening, the bookkeeper of Auschwitz, was convicted in 2015 at age 94 as an accessory to 300,000 murders. He received 4 years imprisonment but died before serving his sentence. Bruno Day, a Stutthof guard, was tried in 2019 at age 93 for contributing to 5,230 murders. As he had been 17 during his service, juvenile court procedures applied. He received a 2-year suspended sentence. These symbolic prosecutions cannot address the fundamental failure of post-war justice. The window for comprehensive accountability closed by 1950 as Cold War priorities overtook denazification goals. The vast majority of concentration camp personnel lived normal lives, raised families, and died peacefully in their beds. Their victims remained in mass graves, their ashes scattered from crematorium chimneys, their suffering reduced to statistics and courtroom exhibits. Irmgard Ferkner, a 96-year-old former concentration camp secretary, was sentenced to 2 years suspended imprisonment in 2022 for complicity in 11,412 murders at Stutthof. She had been a teenage stenographer. The conviction was more about historical memory than meaningful punishment. By the time courts finished processing appeals, she would likely be dead. The geographic distribution of executions tells its own story. American authorities executed 158 war criminals at Landsberg Prison between 1946 and 1951. British forces hanged 240 war criminals, primarily at Hameln. The French executed 104 individuals. Soviet numbers remained classified but likely exceeded all Western totals combined. Polish courts condemned hundreds more. Yet these executions represent a tiny fraction of those who participated in the Holocaust. Estimates suggest that between 500,000 and 1 million Germans directly participated in mass murder during World War II. This includes concentration camp staff, Einsatzgruppenpersonal, order police battalions, Wehrmacht units involved in atrocities, civilian administrators, railway workers who transported victims, and countless others who enabled the killing process. Of these, fewer than 5,000 faced any serious criminal proceedings. Less than 1% received punishment proportionate to their crimes. The bureaucratic nature of Nazi mass murder complicated prosecution efforts. Unlike traditional war crimes, committed by individual soldiers against specific victims, the Holocaust involved systematic cooperation by thousands of ordinary people. Camp guards processed arrivals, clerks maintained records, doctors conducted selections, drivers transported victims, cooks prepared meals for staff. Each participant could claim their role was minor, their personal contribution insignificant. Yet this bureaucratic division of labor was precisely what made the Holocaust possible. The system relied on ordinary people doing their jobs within an extraordinary machine of death. The camp guard who unlocked barrack doors each morning enabled the entire system to function. The secretary who typed deportation orders was as essential as the guard who operated gas chambers. Post-war courts struggled to assign criminal responsibility for this collective enterprise. The international legal framework also limited prosecutions. War crimes law focused on violations of the Hague and Geneva Conventions, governing treatment of prisoners of war and civilians in occupied territory. The systematic murder of a state's own citizens, which comprised the majority of Holocaust victims, fell into a legal gray area. The charge of crimes against humanity was new and untested. Many courts preferred to prosecute under established war crimes statutes rather than break new legal ground. Practical challenges further hampered justice efforts. Witnesses had been murdered, scattered as displaced persons, or traumatized beyond the ability to testify. Documentary evidence had been destroyed in bombing raids or deliberately eliminated by fleeing SS personnel. Perpetrators provided false identities and contradictory alibis. Military courts operating under expedited procedures had limited time for thorough investigation. The sheer scale of the crimes overwhelmed judicial systems designed for individual cases. Concentration camps had processed millions of victims over 12 years. Even major facilities like Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, and Sobibor had destroyed most records before evacuation. Prosecutors had to reconstruct criminal activity from fragmentary evidence, while defendants claimed faulty memory or denial of participation. Language barriers complicated proceedings in international courts. Testimony had to be translated between German, English, Polish, Russian, French, and other languages. Technical terminology related to camp operations often had no equivalent in other languages. Subtle distinctions in meaning could determine whether defendants received death sentences or acquittal. Cultural differences between Allied legal systems created inconsistencies. American courts emphasized efficiency and deterrence. British proceedings stressed procedural regularity and proportionality. Soviet tribunals focused on class struggle and anti-fascist ideology. French authorities prioritized national security and reparations. These different approaches produced vastly different outcomes for similar defendants. The psychology of perpetrators presented another challenge. Many concentration camp personnel appeared to be normal individuals who had committed extraordinary crimes under exceptional circumstances. Defense attorneys argued that anyone might have behaved similarly under Nazi pressure. This banality of evil thesis suggested that systematic conditions, rather than individual choice, explained participation in mass murder. Hannah Arendt's coverage of the Adolf Eichmann trial in 1961 popularized this interpretation. Eichmann appeared to be a bureaucratic functionary rather than a fanatical killer. His defense centered on his role as a small cog in a larger machine. This portrayal resonated with post-war audiences who preferred to see Nazis as either monster criminals or helpless victims, rather than ordinary people who made evil choices. Yet evidence from concentration camp trials reveals a different picture. Guards volunteered for these assignments. They received additional pay, better rations, and preferential treatment. Many requested transfers to camps rather than frontline duty. Once assigned, they could request reassignment if they found the work objectionable. Few did, instead. Testimony shows that many guards took sadistic pleasure in tormenting prisoners. The case of Irma Gracie illustrates this pattern. Born in 1923, she volunteered for concentration camp service at age 18. Her supervisors noted her enthusiasm for the work. She received multiple promotions based on performance. During her trial, she expressed no remorse and claimed she would do the same again. This was not someone coerced into participation, but someone who embraced it. Female guards presented particular challenges for post-war justice systems. Traditional gender stereotypes suggested that women were naturally nurturing and peaceful. The idea that young women could commit acts of extraordinary cruelty challenged assumptions about female nature. Defense attorneys exploited these biases by portraying their clients as misguided girls, led astray by male superiors. Yet female guards often proved more brutal than their male counterparts. They had direct contact with women and children, prisoners in ways that male guards did not. They supervised barracks, conducted searches, and oversaw work details. Their intimate knowledge of prisoner vulnerabilities enabled psychological torture that complemented physical abuse. Elisabeth Volkenrath, the head female guard at Bergen-Belsen, had previously served at Auschwitz and Ravensbrück. Witnesses testified that she personally selected prisoners for death and participated in beatings. She showed no emotion during her trial and maintained her innocence despite overwhelming evidence. When sentenced to death, she filed multiple appeals, claiming her actions were lawful under German authority at the time. The defense of lawful authority became common in war crimes trials. Defendants argued that they were civil servants carrying out legitimate government policies. They claimed no knowledge of the broader context of mass murder. They insisted they had only followed written orders and regulations. This legalistic approach sought to transform war crimes into administrative duties. Courts generally rejected these arguments, but often accepted them as mitigating factors during sentencing. The distinction between those who enthusiastically embraced Nazi ideology and those who reluctantly complied became crucial for determining punishment. Yet this distinction proved difficult to establish based on courtroom testimony years after the fact. The geographic distribution of trials also influenced outcomes. Cases tried in liberated concentration camps, surrounded by physical evidence of atrocities, produced harsher sentences. Defendants faced judges and juries who could smell the crematoriums and see the mass graves. The immediacy of the crimes made denial impossible and clemency unlikely. Trials conducted in neutral locations, with only documentary evidence and witness testimony, were more susceptible to defense arguments. Time and distance allowed defendants to present alternative narratives that might seem plausible to judges unfamiliar with camp realities. The difference between trying Joseph Kramer at Bergen-Belsen in September 1945 versus trying him in London in 1950 would likely have produced different verdicts. Soviet prosecution methods differed markedly from Western approaches. Soviet military tribunals emphasized class struggle and revolutionary justice rather than individual guilt and legal precedent. They viewed Nazi war criminals as representatives of fascist capitalism rather than individual defendants. This ideological framework supported harsh punishment but complicated establishing specific criminal responsibility. Soviet proceedings also operated under different evidentiary standards. Confessions extracted through interrogation carried significant weight, even when obtained through coercion. Witness testimony from Communist Party members received greater credibility than testimony from other sources. These procedural differences meant that identical defendants might receive vastly different treatment depending on which occupying power controlled their cases. The treatment of concentration camp kapos, prisoners who collaborated with SS authorities, revealed the complexity of wartime moral choices. These individuals faced impossible situations where cooperation meant survival and resistance meant death. Some kapos used their positions to help fellow prisoners. Others became as brutal as their SS supervisors. Post-war courts struggled to assign criminal responsibility for these survival decisions. At the Belsen trial, 12 kapos sat alongside 33 SS defendants. Some received death sentences, while others were acquitted. The distinction often depended on specific acts of violence rather than general collaboration. A kapo who beat prisoners to death faced execution. A kapo who simply maintained order in the barracks might receive a short prison sentence or acquittal. The moral ambiguity of kapo cases reflected broader questions about collaboration and resistance during the Nazi period. Millions of Germans had participated in some fashion in the Nazi system without directly committing violent crimes. They had voted for Hitler, joined the party for career advancement, worked in armaments factories, served in non-combat military roles, or simply remained silent while atrocities occurred around them. Post-war denazification programs initially attempted to assign guilt based on formal membership in Nazi organizations. Anyone who had been an SS member faced automatic arrest regardless of their specific duties. Party members were banned from government employment and professional positions. This categorical approach created administrative chaos while failing to address individual criminal responsibility. The practical impossibility of prosecuting millions of Germans forced authorities to focus on major war criminals and those directly involved in atrocities. The concept of collective guilt gave way to selective prosecution based on available evidence and political priorities. Most former Nazis were quietly reintegrated into post-war society through employment certificates that attested to their denazification. Church registries became crucial for establishing false identities. Many SS personnel had their deaths falsely recorded by sympathetic clergy, allowing them to assume new names and identities. Others fled to South American countries with established Nazi exile communities. Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Paraguay welcomed German immigrants without extensive background checks. The Vatican played a controversial role in these escape networks through the so-called rat lines. Catholic clergy provided false documentation and travel assistance to war criminals fleeing Allied justice. The rationale was humanitarian assistance to displaced persons. But the effect was to shield major perpetrators from accountability. High-ranking Nazis like Adolf Eichmann, Josef Mengele, and Klaus Barbie escaped through these networks. American intelligence agencies also employed former Nazis for Cold War purposes. The Gehlen organization recruited Wehrmacht intelligence officers and SS personnel for operations against the Soviet Union. Operation Paperclip brought Nazi scientists to America for rocket and weapons development. These programs prioritized anti-communist intelligence over war crimes, accountability. The emergence of the Cold War fundamentally changed Allied priorities by 1948. The Berlin blockade demonstrated Soviet hostility toward the West. The Marshall Plan required German cooperation for European reconstruction. NATO formation made West Germany a crucial strategic ally. In this context, continued prosecution of former Nazis seemed counterproductive to containment strategy. Public opinion also shifted away from war crimes trials. American and British audiences were tired of hearing about Nazi atrocities and eager to move forward with peacetime concerns. Graphic testimony about concentration camps generated fatigue rather than sustained outrage. Defense arguments about following orders resonated with veterans, who understood military discipline and hierarchy. German public opinion never fully supported war crimes trials. Many Germans viewed Allied proceedings as victors' justice rather than legitimate legal processes. They resented having their countrymen executed while Allied bombing of German cities went unpunished. This resentment complicated efforts to establish democratic institutions and rule of law in occupied Germany. The establishment of the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949 created additional pressure for clemency. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer's government needed to integrate millions of former Nazis into the new democratic system. Continued trials and executions would alienate voters necessary for political stability. Adenauer personally lobbied for release of war criminals imprisoned at Landsberg and other facilities. By 1951, most war criminals sentenced by Allied tribunals had been released through commutation programs. The Korean War required German cooperation for rearmament and strategic defense. Former enemies became allies against the communist threat. Justice for Holocaust victims became secondary to geopolitical concerns about Soviet expansion. The German legal system's treatment of Nazi war criminals after 1955 sovereignty proved even more lenient than Allied proceedings. German prosecutors focused on major crimes like murder, while treating most camp personnel as accessories rather than principals. Sentences rarely exceeded 15 years, and early release was common. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials from 1963 to 1965 prosecuted 22 defendants, but most received sentences of 3 to 14 years imprisonment. These proceedings occurred almost 20 years after the crimes, when evidence had deteriorated and witnesses were difficult to locate. Defense attorneys successfully argued that individual guilt could not be established beyond reasonable doubt for bureaucratic mass murder. Subsequent German trials followed similar patterns. The Stuttgart trial of 18 former Sobibor personnel from 1963 to 1966 resulted in acquittals for 10 defendants. Only one received a life sentence. The Treblinka trials in Düsseldorf from 1964 to 1970 produced similar outcomes, with most defendants receiving prison terms of 3 to 12 years. These proceedings established legal precedents that made prosecution of lesser camp personnel virtually impossible. Courts required proof of individual murders rather than participation in the killing process. Guards who maintained security while others operated gas chambers could not be convicted of murder. Clerks who processed victims for deportation were accessories at most. The bureaucratic nature of Nazi crimes provided perfect legal cover for most participants. Medical personnel presented special challenges because their professional status complicated criminal prosecution. Camp doctors who conducted selections, supervised executions, and performed medical experiments clearly violated professional ethics and criminal law. Yet medical licensing boards were reluctant to strip licenses from physicians who claimed they were practicing medicine under exceptional circumstances. Dr. Mengelé's escape to South America became symbolic of impunity for medical war criminals. Despite extensive documentation of his experiments at Auschwitz, he lived openly in Argentina and Brazil for decades. German authorities issued arrest warrants but made no serious efforts at extradition. He died peacefully in 1979 without facing trial for his crimes. Other camp doctors received lenient treatment even when prosecuted successfully. Dr. Hans Eisele from Dachau was sentenced to death by American authorities in 1945, but had his sentence commuted to life imprisonment and was released in 1952. When German authorities issued new charges in 1958, he fled to Egypt and practiced medicine under false credentials until his death. The pattern of escape, impunity, and comfortable exile repeated throughout the post-war period. Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, worked for American intelligence agencies before fleeing to Bolivia, where he became a successful businessman. John Demjanjuk lived peacefully in Cleveland for decades before his identity as a concentration camp guard was discovered. Even after deportation and trial, he returned to Germany, where he died before serving his sentence. These cases demonstrate the fundamental failure of post-war justice systems to address the scope and nature of Nazi crimes. The legal frameworks developed for traditional warfare proved inadequate for bureaucratic genocide. Individual criminal responsibility could not capture the collective nature of systematic mass murder. The passage of time allowed perpetrators to escape accountability through death, false identity, or legal technicalities. Recent symbolic prosecutions of elderly defendants serve more as historical education than meaningful punishment. Courts convict 90-year-old former guards as accessories to thousands of murders, but impose suspended sentences due to age and health considerations. These proceedings acknowledge historical guilt while avoiding actual punishment. The last major Nazi war crimes trial ended in 2022 with the conviction of Irmgard Furchner, a 96-year-old former concentration camp secretary. Her 2-year suspended sentence for complicity in over 11,000 murders represents the final chapter in 7 decades of limited accountability. By the time appeals are exhausted, all surviving perpetrators will be dead. Archives continue to reveal new evidence of unpunished crimes. The Erelson archives contain millions of documents identifying previously unknown perpetrators. Historical research has expanded our understanding of the geographic scope and bureaucratic complexity of Nazi mass murder. Yet legal accountability remains frozen in time, limited to cases prosecuted decades ago under different evidentiary standards. The failure to achieve comprehensive justice for Nazi war crimes carries contemporary implications. It established precedents for impunity that resonate in modern conflicts. When perpetrators of mass atrocities calculate their risks, They remember that most Nazi war criminals lived normal lives despite committing extraordinary crimes. The numbers tell the complete story. Between 1945 and 1950, Allied authorities executed approximately 700 war criminals in all theaters. American tribunals hanged 158 defendants, primarily at Landsberg Prison. British forces executed 240 individuals, mostly at Hamel. French authorities carried out 104 death sentences. Soviet executions numbered in the hundreds, but exact figures remain classified. Polish courts condemned several hundred more defendants. These totals represent less than 0.1% of those who participated in Nazi mass murder. Conservative estimates suggest that 500,000 Germans directly contributed to Holocaust operations through concentration camp service, Einsatzgruppen participation, deportation logistics, or administrative support. Liberal estimates reach 1 million or more when including Wehrmacht units involved in atrocities, police battalions that conducted mass shootings, and civilian officials who implemented genocidal policies. The contrast becomes stark when examining specific facilities. Auschwitz-Birkenau employed approximately 8,000 SS personnel between 1940 and 1945. Of these, fewer than 100 faced trial in any jurisdiction. Most lived peacefully in post-war Germany and Austria. They worked normal jobs, raised families, and collected pensions based partly on their wartime service. Their victims numbered over 1 million. Treblinka operated for just 13 months between July 1942 and August 1943, but murdered approximately 800,000 people. The entire staff consisted of fewer than 150 Germans and Austrians, plus several hundred Ukrainian auxiliaries. When the camp was dismantled, most personnel received new assignments or returned to civilian life. Only a handful faced post-war prosecution. The geographic distribution of impunity followed predictable patterns. Personnel from camps in Western Europe were more likely to face trial than those from Eastern European facilities. Defendants captured in American or British zones received more procedural protections than those in Soviet custody. Camp staff who surrendered to Western allies often received lighter sentences than those tried by Eastern European courts. Yet even in Western jurisdictions, the pattern remained consistent. Most defendants received sentences proportionate to property crimes rather than mass murder. Guards who killed hundreds received 10 to 15 years imprisonment. Doctors who murdered thousands through medical experiments got similar terms. Administrative personnel who processed millions for deportation faced minimal punishment if prosecuted at all. The legal system's inability to conceptualize bureaucratic genocide created systematic undercharging. Prosecutors focused on specific acts of violence that could be proven beyond reasonable doubt, rather than participation in the broader killing process. A guard who beat individual prisoners to death faced murder charges. A guard who maintained perimeter security while mass murder occurred inside faced lesser charges or no prosecution. This narrow focus missed the essential nature of Nazi crimes. The Holocaust succeeded because of systematic cooperation by thousands of ordinary people performing routine tasks. Railway workers transported victims on schedule. Civil servants processed deportation orders efficiently. Bank officials transferred confiscated assets legally. Each participant's individual contribution seemed minor, but the collective result was unprecedented mass murder. Post-war societies struggled to confront this reality because it implicated far more people than anyone wanted to acknowledge. If everyone who facilitated Nazi crimes faced punishment proportionate to their contribution, entire communities would have been decimated. German society would have collapsed entirely. The choice became selective prosecution of major criminals, or comprehensive accountability that seemed politically impossible. The decision to prioritize stability over justice shaped every subsequent policy choice. Denazification gave way to reintegration. Prosecution gave way to clemency. Documentation gave way to amnesia. The needs of the living outweighed the rights of the dead. Cold War politics provided convenient justification for decisions made primarily for domestic political reasons. This pattern repeated in other contexts throughout the post-war period. Japanese war criminals received similarly lenient treatment when American priorities shifted toward containing communism in Asia. Unit 7. 3-1 personnel who conducted medical experiments were granted immunity in exchange for research data. Most lived peaceful lives despite committing crimes comparable to their German counterparts. The South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission later adopted similar logic when dealing with apartheid-era crimes. The emphasis was on truth-telling and social healing rather than criminal prosecution. Amnesty was granted to those who fully disclosed their activities. The model prioritized political transition over accountability for systematic human rights violations. These precedents demonstrate the persistent tension between justice and stability in post-conflict societies. Legal systems designed for individual crimes struggle to address systematic state violence involving thousands of participants. The scale of complicity often makes comprehensive prosecution politically impossible, even when legally justified. Yet the failure to achieve accountability carries its own costs. Victims and their descendants experience systematic injustice when perpetrators escape punishment. Historical memory becomes distorted when crimes are minimized or forgotten. Future perpetrators learn that mass atrocities rarely result in personal consequences for individual participants. The Nazi case established a template for impunity that persists in contemporary conflicts. Commanders who order mass executions may face international prosecution, but foot soldiers who carry out orders typically escape accountability. Administrative personnel who facilitate genocide through bureaucratic processes rarely face charges. The bureaucratic nature of modern mass atrocities provides protection similar to what Nazi perpetrators enjoyed. Recent developments in international criminal law attempt to address these limitations. The Rome Statute establishing the International Criminal Court includes charges for crimes against humanity and genocide that encompass systematic rather than individual criminal conduct. Command responsibility doctrine holds superiors accountable for subordinate crimes even without direct orders. Yet practical challenges remain similar to those faced by post-war tribunals. International courts have limited jurisdiction and enforcement power. Most cases involve defendants from weak states unable to protect their nationals. Major powers refuse to ratify international agreements that might subject their personnel to foreign prosecution. Political considerations continue to outweigh legal principles when vital interests are at stake. The documentary record of Nazi war crimes trials reveals the gap between legal ideals and political realities that persists today. Prosecutors understood that they were addressing unprecedented crimes that challenged existing legal categories. They recognized that individual responsibility could not capture the collective nature of bureaucratic genocide. They knew that most perpetrators would escape punishment regardless of their efforts. Yet they proceeded because the alternative was complete impunity for systematic mass murder. The trials established legal precedents for international prosecution of war crimes and crimes against humanity. They created historical records that documented the scope and nature of Nazi atrocities. They provided some measure of justice for victims, even when comprehensive accountability proved impossible. The men and women who operated Nazi concentration camps understood exactly what they were doing. They were not confused bureaucrats following abstract orders, but active participants in systematic murder. They volunteered for these assignments, received additional compensation, and often requested extended service. When liberation came, they attempted to destroy evidence and escape accountability. Some succeeded completely, dying peacefully decades later without ever facing charges. Others faced trial but received sentences grossly disproportionate to their crimes. A few received appropriate punishment through execution or lengthy imprisonment. The vast majority fell into the first category, living normal lives while their victims remained in unmarked graves. The failure to achieve comprehensive justice for Nazi war crimes represents one of the 20th century's greatest missed opportunities for legal accountability. It established precedents for impunity that continue to influence international responses to mass atrocities. It demonstrated that political considerations consistently outweigh legal principles when addressing systematic state violence. In 1999, construction workers renovating the Landsberg prison discovered a sealed chamber containing the cremated remains of war criminals executed by American authorities between 1946 and 1951. The ashes had been stored there for over 4 decades, while prison officials debated their proper disposal. No one wanted to claim responsibility for the final resting place of men who had murdered millions. The discovery provided a final metaphor for post-war justice. The executioners had done their duty within the narrow scope provided by military tribunals and political authorities. They had hanged several dozen camp commandants, doctors, and senior guards whose crimes were so documented and egregious that punishment became unavoidable. Then they had sealed away the evidence and moved on to other priorities. The ashes were quietly disposed of without ceremony or announcement. No memorials marked their location, no historical plaques explained their significance. The men who had operated history's most efficient killing machine had achieved in death the anonymity they had sought in life. Justice had been reduced to a few hundred cremated remains in a forgotten prison chamber.